This is the assembly procedure for the D1M WX1 Internet of Things weather station. The unit is supplied as a kit. The first step will be to identify all the parts. We have a printed circuit board, a micro USB cable which we will use later on for programming, a small bag of parts, a BH1750 light intensity sensor, a BME280 environmental sensor, and a D1 Mini microprocessor based on the ESP8266. Solar panel and a lithium-ion cell. Only simple hand tools are needed. We have a small pair of diagonal cutters, needle nose pliers, and a Phillips screwdriver. You also need a good soldering iron or soldering station. I have the Exotronic 3020 soldering station here. We'll set these small parts aside for the moment and open up the bag. The bag contains a piece of wire, a TP4056 charger, some hinges which we'll use to mount the solar cell switches, a stick of male headers, resistor, some switches, connectors. This is an important little device. This is a shunt. And we have some hardware here, nylon hardware. We're going to use the hardware to turn the PC board into a little fixture which will greatly improve the ability to wire it without any difficulty. And we'll just make these hardware items finger tight. Now we have a little table which we can use to organize the parts. First thing we need to do is to cut off 4 individual pins. And you do this carefully with a pair of diagonal cutters. These pins will go in the location of the TP4056 charger. Putting the long tail of the pin through the board. Now we need to set the breakout board on these pins in the proper orientation. Battery minus to battery minus, in minus to in minus, and so on. Once we have that, we'll solder the pins on the top side of the board. Four places. And we will turn the board over and solder on the back side. It's always good to check your work, and another tool that might be useful to have is a magnifying glass. And I'm checking right now, and these are not the best solder joints, so let's clean them up a bit. You put the iron against the pin and then put some solder in on the opposite side at the base of the pin. Take another look. Much better. Cut off the excess length of the pin. Be careful of your eyes when you do this. And I'm going to fix up the soldering yet again. Well, I didn't have the iron hot enough, that's the problem. That's the charger. Now let's go to the D1 Mini. All these components are static sensitive, so you should always work with care. The D1 Mini is supplied with a number of headers. At your option, you could use these stackable headers, and that would enable you to make easy connections to the D1 Mini afterwards, if you're going to experiment with it. If this is your first project, I would use the male headers, and there are 2 sticks of male headers. You put the long pieces through first, and we lay the D1 Mini on top. And you see, using the board like this as a fixture to hold the pins, the breakout board stays nice and square, which would be hard to do otherwise. Now we're just going to solder the corners here, just to get it pinned down to start with. And then we'll go back and do the rest. Things are flowing much better now that the gun is hot. Get the pin hot, put the solder on the opposite side. Now let's check. Very good. Turn this over, you might have to put your finger on it. Now it appears to be in there nicely by itself. We'll solder 1 pin and check that it's still flat. Yes. Solder a pin on the opposite corner. Still flat. Now we can go and do the rest. Now I can see that I've bridged a joint here, and some solder sucker would be useful in removing that. But with some care, I think we can take the excess solder out with a gun. Let's check. Very good. Alright, and we'll cut these off as well. Now it doesn't want to come. Always check your work. Looks good. Now we'll put in the environmental sensor. We set the header in with the long pins through the board. Make certain that you get the actual sensor on the upside of the board. There are components on the other side. You can recognize the sensor as being a very small little square metal box. Now notice that just laying the breakout board on the pins, it's at some angle to the motherboard. What you can do is solder just one pin to get it straight, and by putting the tip of the soldering iron on the outside of the board, that raises the board up and keeps it parallel to the printed circuit board. Can you see how it's like that now? And we'll solder the rest the same way. Again, we turn the board over. Those pins could be hot. I just soldered on them. Be careful. We'll solder one in place. Make sure it's still flush against the board, and it's not. It raised up a bit there. So I'm pressing with my finger against the board on pins that I'm not going to be heating. And now it's nicely in place. We solder in the remainder. Inspect the work. One pin is not soldered. Now it is. We'll put in the light sensor, the BH1750 light sensor. It's a 5-pin board supplied with a 5-pin header. Now this board is peculiar in that the pins are labeled on the underside. That's most unfortunate because you must have the light sensor exposed to light, and that means the labeling of the pins will be covered up. The pin labels are also given on the board, and we want to make certain that VCC, which is this pin, is in VCC here. So this orientation is correct. Same procedure here. We'll put the tip of the gun iron on the outside. Raise it up nice and square. Solder one pin. I'm holding that square there while the solder solidifies, and now we'll do the rest. Use the minimum amount of solder, but make certain that the entire solder pad is covered. And likewise, we're going to do this on the back side. We'll solder one pin. Make sure it's nice and square with the board. And we'll solder the remaining pins. Inspect the work and cut off the excess pins. Be careful of your eyes. Now we have a little header here. We need 2 pins for that. In this one, unlike the breakout boards, we're going to put the short ends of the pins through and solder from the back side. Now, what you can do here is hold it in place with the shunt, which will provide some thermal insulation for our fingers. And actually it holds it up off the board. So we don't have to hold it in places at all. And it's square. This is a little shunt that's used to supply power to the sensor boards. If you needed external sensors, you would have to remove the power from these sensors so they don't interfere with the signal. Now, we also have a header here which would be used for additional sensors. And again, we put the short end, the short tail of the pins through the PCB. And I think we're going to use the same little shunt to protect our fingers from the heat. Make certain it's nice and square. It should be square with the board. It is. We can take that off and put it back. And do the remaining pins. Let's check these. Perfect. Because the short end of the pin goes through these on these devices, there's no need to cut them off on the other side. Now we're almost done. In general, when you build a printed circuit board, you should start with the lowest components first and put them in. This one doesn't really matter so much. We only have one resistor here. It's a low component. It's going to go into this location, the only resistor location on the board. It's 180K, which you can tell with the color code. And we need to take off these little papers if they came. We can bend the leads down with our fingers. and push it through the board. You can also use the pointy nose pliers, needle nose pliers, to bend those leads, but the leads are very small, and just putting them by hand. You see how they cross like that? Well, the nice thing about that is it actually holds it in place. But we're only going to solder one of them. Make sure the component is down against the board. It is. The other end is raised up a little bit. We'll push that one in. Solder the other end. Check. Good. Almost done. You have two little switches. Put one there. It's resting on the actual handle of the switch. I'll put the other one in, and then we'll check them both. Whoops, fell out. Fell out again. I'm just going to solder one. Check if it's oriented nicely. Yes, it's square. It's not quite square with the board, so I'm going to, by touching the plastic part, I don't run the risk of burning my finger here. I'm just going to loosen this up a little and then make it nice and square. There we go. And now the solder for that pin is holding it in place. We don't have to worry about the orientation. Now we fixed it. All right, let's look. Very nice. These pins are short, but we're going to cut them off anyway. Don't leave any little pieces of wire or pins hanging around the board. Well, we're in good shape here. Final step is to put this screw terminal on and make certain that the part that the wires go into face away from the center of the board. This would be used to connect the battery to the unit. Alright. One final thing, we have this little length of 2 conductor wire. It's been pre-stripped for us, that's very nice. What we'll do is twist these wires together, the strands of the wire together, and tin the wires. That's a process of putting a little bit of solder on the wires just to hold them together. Twist them tight, and then just a little bit. They'll solder this copper wire. The solder will flow through the wire very nicely. I didn't have to do that, but I wanted to heat the backside, but I did. And also, if you have any little blobs of solder, you might take them off with the iron like that. Let's do the other end while we're at it here. Twist the strands. Keep the ends tight. The solder flows on that wire very nicely. Keep your iron clean at all times. Always. You can use a wet sponge like this, or a little metal thing. Now this is, I can see that the strands are kind of spread out there. So I may... Alright. Now, red is positive, black is negative. We're going to insert them in a proper location in the board. You can see that this side is labeled plus, so we'll put the plus and minus in the right locations. Now there's a little bit of solder there that doesn't let it go through the board. Still, let me put it on the sponge here. Plus goes through, the minus doesn't. There we go. I just wasn't getting it in straight. I'll straighten these wires up and put them both in. There we go. Now I'm keeping that in place with my finger far from the place where we're going to solder it, and so I don't burn my finger. It's held in now with that wire, and we'll do the other side. Okay. Trim the leads. Make sure they're not touching each other. Inspect the soldering. Very good. That completes the printed circuit board. Now we have some software to do. And we will connect the lithium ion cell later. So I'm going to stop here, and we're going to do a separate video for the software.